Well, good evening, everyone. Appreciate you coming out. I hope nobody came to the church last week. I tried to get it out as quickly as I knew it was unwise to leave our yard and come this way, so hopefully nobody ended up here. And I'm glad you came out tonight. So we are going to pick up where we were supposed to be last week, and 2 weeks ago we kind of finished, well, we did finish chapter 1, and today we're going to go into chapter 2, but I want to just back up for just a few minutes at verses 23 and 24 of chapter 1 and just kind of lead into chapter 2, just so you know that's why your notes are that way. And we are not going to finish chapter 2 today, we're just going to get to the end of verse 8. But before we start, let's open with prayer. Father, thank you for another day. Thank you for the snow that you have sent. Thank you for the good roads that we have, the warm houses, a warm church. We have so many reasons to be thankful, and I pray that you would help us to remember to do so, that we would not be a complaining people, but we would be a grateful and a thankful people. Thank you for giving us your word. Thank you for giving us your Holy Spirit. We have the ability to read and comprehend. You give us the ability to apply so that we can be changed and walk in holiness before you. And I pray that tonight you would both encourage us and challenge us. You would speak to us by your Holy Spirit, and you would guide our thoughts, our discussion, and all that we say and do. In Jesus' name, amen. So if somebody would care to read verses 23 through to chapter 2, verse 8, that would be great. Good. Thanks, Melinda. So in verse 23, Paul says that he calls God as witness to his soul. So he is appealing to God in his defense. He is not at all convicted in his conscience as to trying to pull one over on them. He's very open as to his reasons why he has not come. And he doesn't just depend on his own word, but he is free to appeal to God as his defense, that what he is saying is truth, and they can trust him for it. But then he says, I call God as witness to my soul that to spare you I did not come again to Corinth. To spare you I did not come again to Corinth. I don't know why I have Corinth in brackets there or quotes. Shouldn't have its own set of quotes. It's not like he's coming to Corinth. It is the name of the city, and so that was just a mistake that second set of quotes is there. But sparing them from coming, that word spare is not used very often in the Bible, and I've got 3 references, other places where Paul uses that word. Romans 8:32, he said, who did not spare his own son, but delivered him over for us all, how will he not also with him freely give us all things? Again in Romans 11:21, for if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. And 2 Corinthians 13:2, when I come again, I will not spare you. So the idea of to spare you, I did not come again to Corinth, that kind of language and that terminology for Paul would almost exclusively be in terms of judgment. It's sparing them from something that's quite bad, God did not spare Jesus, but he poured out his wrath on him. If God did not spare the natural branches, talking about Gentiles being grafted into the olive tree that is the faith of the patriarchs. And God did not spare the natural Jews who were naturally born into that tree, but if they rebelled and rejected, they're cut off. There's no sparing because of your heritage. And in the same way, when we get to the end of this book, whenever that is, we'll find out that Paul is going to visit, and he's going to come, and the nature of his coming will be dependent on how they've responded to this letter and how they've changed in their behavior from the sorrowful visit until when he gets there. And if they would still want to go and be difficult, then he will not spare them when he goes then either. So they can repent and turn in his absence, or they can wait until he gets there. But either way, he's going to challenge them on it. And if they'll receive it by letter form, they don't have to receive it in person. But if they won't receive it in letter, they'll get it in person. So he's not afraid of them, but that's the nature of him wanting to spare them, is he didn't want to go there and just heap sorrow upon sorrow on them. So he has great compassion for them. Also, verse 24, not that we lord it over your faith, but are workers with you for your joy, for in your faith you are standing firm. It's not just for the sake of exacting authority over them that Paul would have written them, visited them, and now write them again. It's for their good, and it's for their joy. So Paul is not just looking for a reason or an excuse to prove his authority to them or to himself. It's really when there is a bona fide need that he would either write or visit. So the question then is not if Paul will visit, but just when. He is going to come. He has every intention to go, and he does go. It's just a matter of when will he go and what will be the nature of that kind of a visit. So then that leads right into chapter 2, verse 1. But I determined this for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. The word sorrow would mean very deep grief or pain. It's not just a very light, I'm feeling a little bit down, or just not happy, but deep grief, deep pain. Proverbs 15:13 says, a joyful heart makes a cheerful face, but when the heart is sad, the spirit is broken. So that's not just a slight sadness, but it's from the inside out. It's all consuming. And you all have experienced that from time to time. You know what that deep, deep sadness in your heart, in your soul, when your soul just aches. And Isaiah 35:10 says, and the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion, with everlasting joy upon their heads. They will find gladness and joy, and sorrow and sighing will flee away. Same idea. We can sing the song that was written from that verse, and we can sometimes get through it so quickly that we forget what sorrow and sighing is really referring to, and not if you don't understand the sorrow and sighing, you're not going to understand the joy, because they are in direct contrast to one another. The deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy, and that's really what Isaiah is emphasizing here. That Isaiah 35 is the desert blooming, and Israel being restored, and the tremendous joy that comes out of that, because the precursor to that was what? Captivity. They were taken out of the land before they could be restored to the land. And so the joy is that much greater because the heartache and the pain was so real and so painful. So that's the nature of Paul saying, I determined that I would not come to you in sorrow again. I find it interesting the way that he words this in verse 1. He says, for my own sake, that I would not come to you in sorrow again. This is inspired, so God inspired him to write it exactly this way. And yet it seems like there was maybe a little bit of a latitude in how Paul reasoned within himself, whether he would visit them again in person or whether he would write to them again. And God seems to give him some freedom because he doesn't say I was compelled to not come, or that the Spirit prevented me from coming, as he has written that other places. But this, it seems maybe a little bit less clear, a little bit more of his choice, however that worked in his heart. But he didn't want to come in sorrow himself, nor did he want to come and bring them sorrow. Verse 2, for if I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? I've never really thought about Paul in his relationship with the Corinthians in this way, in these believers, and he cares so deeply for them, not only in him giving to them, but also in him receiving from them. And that comes out in verse 2. If I cause you sorrow, who then makes me glad but the one whom I made sorrowful? So not only does Paul care very deeply, but they are a source they are a source of incredible joy for him. And so if he goes and has to be harsh and makes them feel sorrowful, then they can't feed his joy. And he really does feed off that. And he really does want it. So he's got two reasons for not wanting to go in a harsh way. He doesn't want to have to do that, but he also doesn't want to take away their joy because he wants to receive their joy. It's quite a relationship that he has with them. Now, what was Paul's... Well, maybe I shouldn't even ask that. I probably have it. Okay, no sense asking what I've told you. He was an apostle to the Corinthians. He was not their pastor, as we understand the pastorate. A pastor stays in a local church. Paul didn't do that. Paul went from church to church. He was an apostle over a number of churches in a number of cities. And so we don't have anything that would compare to that. If you were in more of a mainline denomination, if you were Catholic or if you were Anglican or if you were United, you'd understand this concept better, because we would have bishops, or whatever the title is. We would have people that would be over us as a church. And the role of FEBC and Kevin Stone, that doesn't transfer over, because he doesn't have the authority to come in and tell us anything unless we invite him. If we don't invite him, he really can't come. He can't just pop in. I mean, he could pop in, but he can't just come and say, I'm going to preach to you today, and we have no say in the matter. But there are churches where they do come under that kind of authority, and that would definitely be there. I can only think of bishop, but if the bishop would come, the bishop is clearly over the pastor. And probably the bishop has put the pastor there. And if he would want to come and speak to the congregation, that would be his right at any time. We don't have any parallel to that. But that would be the nature of Paul's relationship with the church, is that he's not their local pastor. He's the one who planted the church and then left. And he's come again, but he's left. And he's hoping to come again, but it's that infrequent, it's that rare, that he doesn't come on a regular circuit. And even if he did, he's not with them day to day. So he doesn't have that kind of relationship, that kind of interaction with them. And yet, it's astounding to me how much he cares for people that, yes, he stayed there a long time when he went the first time, but he's only been there once since then. And for him to still care that deeply for these people that have been difficult for him and whom he hasn't seen for a little while. God gave him an astounding capacity. Not only was he intellectual, an academic, but he had tremendous heart for people. And it's not like I've done any kind of a study on this, but it seems to me that those two don't typically run together. You tend to be one or the other. Those who are very, very relational, they tend to be less academic. And those who are more academic, they tend to be less relational. And it's just so odd and unusual to find someone who is really excelling in both. See, he's closer than you, Troy. But as God gave Paul the capacity, then what does God expect? If God gives you a capacity for something, what does he expect? Expects you to do it. Yes. And he expects you to do it to your full capacity. So if he gives you, this is the scary thing about our relationship with God, is that if God gives you a capacity for something greater than people in your circle, then you cannot just serve him to the capacity of people in your circle. You have to serve him to the capacity that he has given you. And so you can only look around at people around you so much to find kind of your level of where can I serve, how much can I serve, to what extent, in how many different areas. It is such a unique thing between you and God. And you can only look around so much. You maybe can do that a bit. But if what God is calling you to is fairly easy, then he's likely calling you to more. Because anytime you're running at full capacity is not easy. It's hard. And it takes purposefulness. It takes being very intentional. It takes being very careful that you don't push too hard and somehow injure yourself, or that you don't go too far and do something that would hamper. But running right at the edge, it's a difficult thing to do for any length of time. And I believe there's an ebb and a flow within that edge, but it should never be too easy. If it's a piece of cake, then you probably should go back on your knees, because God probably has something else that he expects you to do. So in that regard, Paul was given an amazing capacity, but then he had a heavy responsibility to hold to that capacity. As God gave him a heart for hundreds of people, God expected him to have a heart for hundreds of people. And he was not permitted to just care about one church. He was expected and required to care for all those that were under him. Luke 12:48 says, "To whom much is given, much is required." And that has always been a frightening verse to me, where I would love to be greatly equipped, but I don't like to think about what that would then do for the requirement and the expectation. I just want to be equipped so that what I'm doing would be easier, without taking into account, well, if God would equip me more, he would expect more of me. So then this is no longer enough. I want to take a bit of a step sideways now and come out of 2 Corinthians per se and apply this into the local church. And as it relates to pastors in the church. Now, I'm not an apostle. There are no apostles. So that office doesn't apply anymore. But as far as the relationship between a pastor and a church, how long should a pastor stay in a church? Is there a magic number? Till God leads him elsewhere? Good, good. So can you put a time frame on that, just in point of form? No. God has the right to do whatever he wants to do. But that really should be it, until God releases you or until God calls you somewhere else. And I've thought about this a fair bit over, the last 5 or 10 years, that it's not uncommon to hear, or it's very common to hear pastors being talked about called to a church. But I hardly, if ever, hear pastors talk that they've been called away from a church. They're called to it, but they tend to just leave. And I never hear the same language when they're leaving as when they're coming. And to me, that means there's been a bit of a breakdown. If you're that clear on telling everybody that you're called to a church, then if you understand what the calling is, you should be equally clear when it's time to leave that you are called away. You shouldn't be telling people that you resigned or that you just chose to leave, but that God, God has, God has released you, God has called you out. It should be that same sense. I was talking with a pastor a little while ago, and I didn't bring it up, but he brought it up. That when he started pastoring, he was told by someone that he was very close to that when you go to a church, you should plan to stay about 10 years. And he said if you plan to stay longer than 10 years, you should have a very good reason for doing so. And if you plan to stay less than 10 years, you should have a very good reason for doing so. And I thought about that, and I thought, okay, does that fit? Is that scriptural? Colette doesn't think so. I heard it, if the rest of you didn't. It strikes me as too business-minded, too human centered, where it's like, I go there with this vision, I go there with this dream, and based on logistical things that people have been able to figure out, there's a certain length of time where people kind of love you no matter what you're doing. They call that the honeymoon period, and then you get past the honeymoon period and you kind of get to work. But you eventually get to a point in time where the newness and the freshness is gone. And then it's, a lot of times, the pastor leaves and the congregation is just fine with him doing that. And then they get to find someone else and they get to start that all over again. And he gets to do the same thing. He goes to a different church and he gets to start that cycle all over again. I was talking to another pastor a few years ago, and he'd been, this is a number of years ago, he was at the church he was pastoring, he'd been there for 8 years. And he's a godly man. And he was telling me that he was struggling with that very thing, like some of the freshness had gone out. And he was wondering, is this God beginning to call me away? He was the kind of guy that he wouldn't just leave because he wanted to. He would leave because he was called. But some of the feelings that he was having and the struggle of ministry was making him wonder if God was preparing him for something else and giving him some discontentment so that he would go somewhere else. I talked with him again not long ago, and I asked him, so how are you doing? Are you more settled now? And he said, yeah, I'm much more settled now. I feel like this is where we're supposed to be for a time again. I'm not feeling like what I was. Feelings come and go. That is to be human. But it's how we respond to them and how we act with them. So why do pastors leave churches? Don't overthink it. Ideally, but why or what are some of the reasons why a lot of pastors leave a church? Okay, so it could be a stepping stone. Okay, yeah. Something better comes. Yeah, that's definitely one reason. Conflict. I think that's probably the biggest in my mind. There's trouble in the church, and it would just be very, very hard to stay, and it's just much easier to leave. Anything else? Yeah. So an opportunity, mixing with the calling. Yeah. I think another reason that I honestly think some pastors just get bored. That newness leaves, that freshness, that life, it dries up. And the work at maintaining is really hard. And you can look at some pastors and they have a fairly consistent pattern. You can look at some pastors, and they typically stay at a church for the same length of time. Especially if you look at one that's, say, been doing it for 30, 40 years, and you can look back on the churches he's been at, and oftentimes you can find a pattern. It might be that he's there 5 or 6 years, every single time. And, either he's attracted to churches that grow tired easily, or he's attracted to churches that have conflict, or he just doesn't like to stick it out. Maybe he just gets bored and wants to start all over again. And I've heard some pastors almost intimate that, like, they preach through their list of sermons, and it's just easier to go to another church and preach through that same list again than to keep writing. There is some of that. So, if pastors do tend to come and go, then how close should the congregation get to its pastor? How close relationally? Very aloof? Some churches, they actually kind of do that. Yeah. And like you could hardly help but to feel that way. If we're going to do this again in a few years, then why should I get to know him? He's not staying. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Yep. How close should the pastor come to the congregation? Okay. It's interesting. There's a lot of young pastors, when they're starting out, they are told, don't find your closest friends within your church. And you can make friends, but make sure that your closest friends are outside the church, outside the local church. Don't get too close to people. Keep a bit of a distance. You need a best friend, but it shouldn't be within your church. It is risky for a pastor to have very close friends within the church, because even within the church, maybe not quite so much here in our setting, but in a lot of urban churches, people do tend to come and go. I was talking with Twyla's cousin in Cold Lake, and the church they attend, there is incredible turnover because of the military base. And it's like every 3 or 4 years you have a brand new congregation because military people are transferred out. They're not allowed to stay. So if that's the nature of the community, it's hard to get to know people, and it's hard to have them plug in and serve because they're only there 2 or 3 years and they're transferred somewhere else. So that whole culture, that environment makes it very difficult. I know, I'm very funny. Thank you for laughing. Apparently, yes. Relationships can also turn sour. And so forming a relationship is risky. And we know that just as human beings. Caring for someone is a risk. It's less risky to put up a wall and not allow people in, because then they can't hurt you. The minute you open the door and let your guard down, you invite people to betray you. You invite people to hurt you. You invite people to say things that cause pain. But on the flip side, I think there are people in the church that can be standoffish to pastors for the very same reasons. Well, he's going to leave in a few years, so why should I invest in him? I'm going to have to do it all over again, so what's the point? Also, if a relationship sours with the pastor, then how do you keep attending that church? And then, is he going to start preaching about you? Are you going to be the subject of his illustrations? That would be not very fun. And I think some people are just too intimidated by pastors. They somehow think that pastors have no struggles, that pastors never struggle with temptation. And so the friendship or the relationship could ever really only be one way. Like, how would you ever possibly contribute anything to the pastor? He's got it all together. But that's such a lie. And I wonder, I don't want to attribute everything to Satan and to his minions, but that doesn't come from God. I can tell you that. The idea that pastors are above failure or above reproach or above temptation, that doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from the Scripture. And so either people dream that up all by themselves or they do have help from the dark side. But it's not truth. So I think this wall that sometimes people put up between the pastor and the congregation is actually very harmful. Because if you don't know people, how can you really speak into their life? And if you don't know your pastor, how do you trust him? How do you know that what you're receiving is actually true? Then it does become just like a TV preacher. Now, he can say all the right things. But if you don't know him, then you have no way of knowing if he's a hypocrite or if he actually is a man of integrity. All you're going by is just the spoken word, which is not, that's a teacher, that's not a pastor. That's not shepherding. You can't shepherd someone you've never met, and you can't be shepherded by someone you've never met. You can be taught by someone you've never met, but you can't be shepherded. So I believe that a pastor should be close to his congregation, and ideally, the congregation should be close to its pastor. Because the goal is not conflict. The goal is peace and unity. And so when there do become little bumps in the road, rather than walk away, we should address them so that we can restore the unity, we can restore the path and make it straight and level so that the openness and the transparency can continue and in fact even grow. If it begins to shrink back so that we're just at arm's length, then it's not building up the body. It's not healthy. Also, I really don't know how we imitate each other if we don't know each other. The preachers that are on TV, I really have no way of imitating them because I don't know what their lifestyle is. I could imitate their method of teaching, but that's not character. So there's no way to imitate somebody that you don't know. And it's not just a matter of everybody imitating the pastor. It's together, us imitating one another. There's a number of people in this church that I try very hard to imitate because they're godly people. And I look up to them and I respect them. And I've gotten to know them well enough that I see the consistency in their character. And there are things that many of you do that spur me on. And that's part of having that relationship. It's a two-way street. It's never a one-way street. You'll never know how much you challenge me and how much you encourage me and how much you spur me on by the way that you live your life. Every single Christian struggles with certain temptations. No Christian struggles with every temptation. There are some that are much more real for you than others. And we don't share necessarily the same ones. So I know what my temptations are. You know what your temptations are. And I'm not saying that we air all of that publicly. That's not helpful because that would tend to just drag us down. But you should be very close with at least one other person in this church. Someone that you can know and trust enough that you can open up about not just the light temptations that you fell to once, but the intense ones that you find so hard to resist, almost on any given day. You know, whenever that one comes, man, that one scares me. That one trips me up more often than I like to admit, even to myself. But I feel like I know you enough that I am tired of doing this myself. And I want to open up to you, and I trust you that you won't think different of me. I trust you that you won't take this and use it to my harm. You won't betray me. But I want to trust you because I want you to help me. I want you to hold me accountable. But you're only going to do that if you have some sense that there's a commonality. You're not going to open up about a very deep and intense temptation if you have gotten the sense from the other person that he or she does not struggle with that. No one's going to do that. Because I don't think you have anything to offer me. If you don't struggle with it, then you can't help me through the struggle. Because it's only those who really know the intensity of the battle who can come alongside someone and say, well, I know how hard it is. These are some of the things that I've learned to help me say no. Someone who doesn't struggle, they'll just say, well, quote this verse. That's all I do. And it works every time. You know, that's not very helpful. I've done that. And I still find it so hard not to fall. I need more. I need a brother or sister who knows the same struggle that I do. But someone's got to take that first step of opening up to a weakness that they are learning victory over, so that somebody else will feel comfortable to come and say, I really appreciate you sharing. I battle with this too, but I want more victory. Would you walk with me? Would you help me? So somebody has to be vulnerable. Somebody has to be honest. And I think that level of honesty, Satan does not want us to do. And he will work at keeping us from that. He will tell you lies that you can't trust that person, or that they will think less of you, or they will spread it around. Or if you open up to that kind of failure, you won't be allowed to serve in any way. You'll be kicked out. Nobody will want you. They might not even let you come to church. They'll take away everything that you have. It's too risky. You can't do that. And so Satan wants you to keep that all bottled up inside. But I believe God would have us open up to one another who are trustworthy, but in a way that doesn't just air all of our faults and air all of our failures just so that we can all sound lousy, but in a way that works to build up the body towards righteousness and holiness. And so in that way, I am much more interested in how you walk in victory with your intense temptations than with your light temptations. As much as I may be passively interested in how you deal with all of your temptations, I'm really only interested in how you gain victory over the hard ones. The easy ones, anybody can do the easy ones. But I want to know how you find victory in the hard ones. So in terms of joy versus sorrow, this is Paul's heart. He doesn't want to cause them unnecessary pain because he cares that much for them. And he's not interested in asserting his power over them. He wants to see their joy from their obedience. He cares that deeply about them that when they're doing well, that gives him joy. And when they're hurting, that causes him pain. Verse 3, he says, "This is the very thing I wrote you, so that when I came, I would not have sorrow from those who ought to make me rejoice, having confidence in you all that my joy would be the joy of you all." So the purpose for writing rather than visiting was so they could process his rebuke and act on it, so that when he visited, it would be to mutually encourage each other. So he makes a conscious choice that he needs to give them a rebuke and he chooses to do it in written form rather than verbally. This may seem like a silly side note, but I think it's worthwhile, because I think we struggle a lot with the concept of rebuking someone. There are pros and cons to written rebukes and to verbal rebukes. And I think it'd be worthwhile for us to take a moment just to talk this through a little bit, because I believe we have a God-given responsibility to rebuke each other. We have a responsibility to know each other enough to know when brother or sister is sinning. And then God expects us to go and hold that person accountable. So we have a responsibility to do it. We also have a responsibility to do it well, not to do it poorly. So what are some pros of a written rebuke? Why would you ever want to write someone a letter and correct their behavior? Good. Good. Yep. So there's better thought, better preparation, organization. Good. Anything else? We're going to get to the cons in a minute, but let's just worry about the pros for now. So yes, it can be misunderstood. Yep. Yep. It does not demand an immediate response. Yep. And that is definite pro. Yep. 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 But I agree, writing something out is, I mean, even if you're struggling to control your emotion, the other person doesn't necessarily grasp that by the written word. So you can say things in a gentler way than you might be able to verbalize it. Yep. What are some cons of a written rebuke? Twyla said the potential to be misunderstood. That's definitely there. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes a written can be unemotional. Yep. Misunderstood emotions. Yeah. Yeah. It can be very hard to read the tone of a letter. And we all are doing it unconsciously when you read a letter, and sometimes you get it, sometimes you just totally miss it. Yeah. 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 Especially if there was distance in between and say it was mailed or the person just doesn't open it right away. Yeah. Well, you guys are good. You're hitting on everything that I've written down. The only other one that I thought of for a con is I think a written rebuke is probably a little bit easier to dismiss than a verbal one. I can get a letter, read it, and I can throw it out. I don't have to do anything with it. So that would be one con, is it might be a little bit easier just to dismiss it or ignore it than a verbal one. Oh, exactly. Yes, that can be a tremendous pro. Yeah. He said you can keep it. So you could throw it away, but you could also keep it and reflect on it or refer to it from time to time. So, what would be a pro of a verbal rebuke? Yeah, yeah. Is that a pro or a con? Okay, okay. Especially if it's well thought out. Yeah. Some people like to give a word of correction just off the cuff, and that doesn't always communicate well thought out, but it can. What else? Is there a greater chance of being misunderstood or a lesser chance of being misunderstood? Why? Okay, so you can have interaction, and you can read their response. So generally, when you're talking to someone, you can figure out if they're catching what you're saying, and if someone is totally missing it, like you can say it again. You can clarify yourself. You can explain in a different way. Like you're okay. We're not. You ever been in a conversation like that where we are not tracking? We need to back up and start over again because somehow we're passing in the night and this is not going well. We need to fix it. In a written letter, you got no sense of that. You write out the best you can, but you really don't know until that person gets back to you what they heard you say. But if you're talking to someone face to face, there's a better chance that you can be heard properly. Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so more warmth because there's more. It's a personal thing. Yep. I think you can communicate emotion better, or at least there's a potential to communicate emotion better when it's verbal. You can also communicate emotion very badly when it's verbal if you lose control, and then you might wish you hadn't done that. But then that's on you. We are always responsible every single time we lose control. We can never truly ever blame anybody else because it's always a choice. So, what would some cons be of a verbal rebuke? That's all a definite possibility. Yep, that would be a negative. So the cause of that would be just too much aggression. And that's definitely a con of a verbal rebuke because it can be too aggressive. It's risky. What else? Ah, yes. You might never get around to actually rebuking. Yeah. Yes. Because you cannot guarantee the response. So that's the one attractive thing about writing it, is that they can't hit you. And they can't throw back right away. The worst they could do is call you up or come and see you or something, but at least you got some time. Oh, yes. Yeah, yeah. Anything else you can think of? The one I thought of is it demands an immediate response. The person has to say something, and that really does kind of lean on their character. Or you're assuming that they've got some grace. If you're going to go and rebuke somebody, you are hopeful that they're going to hear it. If you're totally convinced in your mind, they're going to get really mad and stomp off, I doubt you're going to rebuke them unless they are your child. But, a brother or sister in the church, you're not likely to rebuke if you don't think there's any possibility that this is going to go well. Because it does demand, you're going to get something. Very few people are able to just listen passively and say, boy, I really appreciate you coming to me and telling me that. I needed to hear that so bad, and I was hoping somebody would come. And let me pray with you. Thank you so much. You might get that, but I doubt it. You're most likely to get something that's a bit defensive. And so that is hard to do. It's also really tough to initiate. I find it much harder to initiate something verbally face-to-face than I do to sit down and write something by myself. That said, I can probably guarantee that every single one of you, as we went through this, you've got one that you would gravitate towards more than the other. Some of you would prefer to do something written. Others of you would prefer to do something verbally. And why write when you can go and talk to someone? Just get it over with. Do it face to face. Why would I talk to someone face to face when I can write them? And I can let them contemplate, I can let them process, I can let them get past their defensiveness and really take it for what I meant it. I'm not trying to be that aggressive. We've all got our preference. And I think there are times where one is better than the other, but you're probably going to find reasons to go to the one that you would prefer. And the challenge is to actually think it through properly and say, Lord, I believe I need to do this. How would you like me to do it? Should I go and talk to them, even though that is not my preference? And I'm tipping my hand that I prefer to write. I hate confronting people face to face. My biggest fear when I'm doing it is that I will chicken out and I won't actually get there because I find it that hard. That I start visiting and chatting and I've got this thing in the back of my head that I want to get to and I never get there. Or I talk around it and I just can't get to the heart of it. It's that hard for me. I just chicken out. But I can sit down and write it. And I can try very hard to be gracious. But in the written word, I can get there. In the spoken, I find it very hard. I also find it when I'm speaking to somebody one-on-one, my thoughts can race on me, and pretty soon I'm not very lucid. I'm not making sense. Talking in circles. I don't know what I'm saying. Never mind, I hope you have no idea what I'm talking about. And it's really, really hard to follow something through. And especially if the person isn't a real good listener and they interrupt you and they kind of derail where you're going and they don't let you finish. Where in a letter you can always get it through. But I've been misunderstood so often in my letters that it really challenges, you did this because it was easier for you. But they didn't take it that way. And you would have been far better to pick up the phone and to use your words. And then you probably could have conveyed. I don't know if you remember this or not, but it's probably, it's probably 21 or 22 years ago, that I took the youth to a youth retreat, and I was really angry with the speaker. And after coming back, I wrote a letter to 4 Bible colleges, to Miller, to Nipawin, to PRBI, and to Prairie. And I wrote them, all 4 of them, the same letter. And I asked them the same questions. And I tried to be as gracious as I could, but I felt I had the right and the responsibility to do that. 1, I was an alumni. Well, I guess 2, I was an alumni. And the other 2, I was invested in, that I had taken youth to their youth retreats. So I feel like I have the right to do this. And I heard later that they were very offended by what I said. And in fact, they talked among themselves about me. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. That presidents were phoning each other, and they were talking, and they were bad-mouthing me. And I thought, all I did was ask questions. I wasn't accusing. I was asking your stand on this, and they were put out that I had the nerve to ask. It didn't go well at all. And years after, I heard about that this last summer. Like, that was over 20 years ago. And I heard from someone who knew someone that, that really, really bothered him for a long, long time. So I didn't, somehow, the message did not get through. That's a risk in writing something out. If that person doesn't come back to you and say, what did you mean? Where do you get the nerve? How do you think you can talk? If that just ends and there's no response, then I really have no idea how it's been received. And I can go years thinking that, I did a really good thing. And they're thinking, what kind of guy is that? And our paths might never cross, but I haven't done myself any favors. But I had no idea. It wasn't my intention. But if I'd called them up on the phone and talked to them, I don't believe they would have misunderstood me in that way. I could have talked through my reasons so that they would have understood. So we all have our preferences. We all have the things that we would choose to do. What I don't think we have the freedom is to never rebuke one another. That implies that either you're overlooking people's faults or you don't know them enough to see any. And neither is proper. We all have faults. And we should know people close enough that they see some of them. And not that they are confronting for the sake of confronting, but it's to walk in holiness. It's to build one another up. It's to protect our families. It's to protect the body of Christ. That's what walking in love is. Any thoughts on that? Yeah. If I could go back and do it again, knowing then what I knew then, I would have done it the same way. Like, I had good intentions, and I wanted to give them time to write a response. I didn't want to force them to give me an answer over the phone. But knowing how it was received, I wish I'd had some sense of that then, I don't think I would have sent the letter. It didn't go well, so I didn't accomplish anything that I set out to accomplish. So then the letter did me no good. I wish I'd done that different, but I'm not, like, it would have taken someone outside that I really respected to see that potential. I just didn't see them going that way. Yeah. Yeah. Very good point. Yeah. And sometimes the success of it is not up to us because it depends on the other person to receive it. And if they won't receive it, then it probably doesn't really matter what method you choose. It's not going to have a favorable response. Well, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. He was saying the bigger question might be, how do you receive a rebuke? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. I probably could have done well to have someone proofread my letter, because I wouldn't be surprised if I did come across aggressive, and I was very young. So that I can also imagine. I've been on the other end of some of that. I I, I know I have. I can't think of an example, but I know I have in the recent past. Think, well, you're just a young whippersnapper. Who are you to be talking to me? When you get some years of experience under your belt, then you can talk. But you don't know what you're talking about. And there might have been some of that where I was just a lot younger than them, and it's hard for a middle-aged person to take from a 20-something. So I was maybe just setting myself up for failure, the nature of where I was at. And sometimes there is wisdom in just being quiet. Hmm. Hard to bear that in mind in the moment. Yeah. Very true, though. I find now, if I know a rebuke is starting, I try to talk to myself. Just shut up and listen. Shut up and listen. Shut up and listen. Don't say anything. Just keep your face flat and hear them out. And I will literally talk to myself if I feel it starting and when it's going, because I can get defensive in a nanosecond. And then I start thinking of the response. I start ignoring what they're saying. I start getting really aggressive in my own thoughts. And then the battle is lost. When I stop listening and when I'm ready to fire back, then you might as well shut her down. And that's all on me. That's because I haven't been able to hear. I haven't been able to listen. That's that defensiveness that, man, that is so hard. Those are some of the intense temptations that I battle, is being so easily defensive. A couple weeks ago, I was sending out an email for an FEBC agenda, And I got an email in response questioning questioning some of the agenda. And it was in written form. And I had to talk myself down. There was nothing face to face. And yet I had to, okay, Trevor, just take a minute and think it through. And I came to the conclusion that what he was saying was right. But, it threatened me that, how dare you? I've planned this. And now you're telling me that there's a better plan? You don't know, because I know. But, no, I think he was better.